One of the great things about Visual Studio Code is the ecosystem of third-party extensions you can install. Let's mash on that.
Hi everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Asp.Net Monsters. This is going to be part 2 of taking a look at some of the cool plugins that Dave and I have installed in our Visual Studio Code environment. So take it away.
Thanks, Simon. So one of the first ones for me is something called editor config. If you're not familiar with editor config, it's basically, so this came up for us at work because we were fighting over the number of spaces we used for indents.
Is it 3? Because it should be 3.
I should have just suggested something completely different just to throw everybody off. 15. So, half the team was using 4, the other half was using 2, and it was like every time you did a commit, it just messed everything up. So editor config is a really common tool for trying to maintain the consistent coding style. So things like the line endings and the number of indents that you use, all that kind of thing. And it's pretty widely supported. So this actually works out of the box if you have an editor config file. It's just .editor config where you specify this config. If you have that in your root folder, it just your editor will pick it up and then use that formatting. So with Visual Studio Code, you need to install an extension. This is just built in to the support for editor config is built into Visual Studio. So with our team, we're using kind of a mix of Visual Studio Code and Visual Studio, and this we use this to solve the problem. So the file format is pretty simple. You just tell it for this type of file, for example, JavaScript files in this folder, I want to indent using spaces, and I want to indent with 2. And that's really all there is to it. So you install that editor config extension, create an editor config file. So we'll just take a look at an example of that. We'll say that in this case I want to do, you said 3, so we'll set my indent size to 3, and if I go into a TypeScript file and I hit Alt-Shift-F here, you'll see that it reformatted everything for me to 3 spaces, and then it should just do the spacing automatically for me. If I were to do a new if true, it automatically takes me to those 3 spaces. So really useful for avoiding those fights and diffs in commits that just are really hard to review because of the white space that sometimes is easy to ignore and sometimes isn't. So I can change it and come back in here and just reformat my file, and it picks it up all automatically for me.
That's fantastic.
Okay, so moving on to the next one. The next one is I've been doing a lot of Vue development, Vue.js development, and Vue has these things called .vue components, which is where you combine your template, your HTML template, your script, which might be JavaScript or TypeScript, and then if I look at a file that has some, there's also some styling, so you can have your CSS or SCSS, right, all in one file. But without any special tooling, Visual Studio Code doesn't really know what a .vue file is and doesn't know that this part is HTML and this part is TypeScript. So
yeah, because that's kind of a super weird combination of different syntaxes in one file.
Yeah, so there is a plugin called Viter right here, and I'll include the links to these in the show notes. But Viter here is just Vue tooling for Visual Studio Code, and what it lets you do is, it basically just tells Visual Studio Code that this portion of the file is HTML, so that you get proper IntelliSense. So in here, if I wanted to do a p tag, I can just, it knows that I'm in HTML, so it gives me the completion there and the syntax highlight and everything that I would expect. And then likewise in the TypeScript section, I get my code completion in here, and everything kind of works the way you would expect it to. It's not 100% perfect. It's not quite as good as when I'm in a TypeScript file, but it's pretty darn close. So it also includes some other things like snippets, which I honestly don't use all that much, although I do occasionally. So if I was, let's say I was in here, this template doesn't have a script or a style section yet, but here I get all these snippets here for the different types of styles I could do. So if I wanted to do SCSS that's scoped, I can do that. And then I get all my syntax highlighting that I would expect and auto-completion that I would expect. And likewise with script, I can tell it that I want a TypeScript section, and it just makes it easy to get started and create new components. So super useful if you're doing Vue development. Probably not if you're not. So the next one, Simon talked about the plugin for Terraform, and we're going to take a look at one that's for Azure ARM templates. So if you're really just doing Azure and you're using their native infrastructure as code concept with Azure Resource Manager templates, there is a plugin called the Azure Resource Manager Tools, which gives you that same kind of auto-completion and everything right within Visual Studio Code. So it's ARM templates are just big, huge JSON files. But what I did here is just copied one in that was for a VNet, which I don't know a whole lot about in terms of what I actually need to configure. But you define parameters up top, and within the file now I get completion in terms of I can load up parameters, and it actually knows which parameters I have defined here. And I can go and grab, I forget which one that was, probably the VNet name. So code completion in terms of accessing the parameters that you've defined, which is great just for those spelling mistakes and that kind of thing. But you also get code completion in terms of what are the valid properties for this type of resource within this context that we're at right now, which is really good for just understanding what the options are that you need to specify and what's available. So for example, here, if we wanted to create a new resource for this template, I could just say, okay, I want my type and I'm just doing a control space there to trigger the auto completion, but it brings up the options for all the different things I can create in Azure, which is overwhelming. But let's say it was websites. I could create a site, and then everything kind of flows from there, and it knows now that I'm talking about an Azure website and will give me auto completion that's specific for that resource type. So it's super useful. Okay, last one that I wanted to talk about isn't actually an extension. It's just a new feature recently that they rolled out with, I forget which version exactly, but one of the recent updates to Visual Studio Code. And that is this little Npm Script section down at the bottom. So if you're working on a project that has a package.json, which in this case I do, it's this Vue project that we were just looking at. And it has a bunch of scripts in here, one to serve a development server, like run it locally for development purposes, one to build a deployment version, do linting, and run unit tests. It actually goes and extracts all of those tasks for me, those scripts for me, and I can just run them here. And it just launches a terminal, local terminal for me, and runs that within that terminal. So just a really handy shortcut for accessing those scripts within your npm file, package file.
That is handy. I like that one.
Mm-hmm. I've been using it a lot because I actually used to run these mostly outside of Visual Studio Code because I don't know, I wasn't using the built-in terminal all that much, but now that this is here, I've been using this a lot more.
Yeah, I'm a big user of the built-in terminal.
Do you end up with like a bunch of them open?
Yeah, I usually end up with 2 or 3 of them open. Maybe I have like a watch and then something else.
Yeah, running tests and that kind of thing. Cool. So that's all I had for today.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. Well, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Remember to like, comment, share, and write yourself an extension that will tell a joke in this space, because I totally don't have one. Excellent. I'm a very loud kid, though.
Indeed.
All right.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.